The Great War, Part 2. How was it resolved? What were the results? And what was the global impact? Lecture terms. In Part 1 of the Great War lectures, I discussed the fact that there was new military technology being used, which would contribute to the arms race between the two alliance systems that were created prior to the war's beginning. This new military technology ultimately will increase the lethality of the war. And this will lead to the invention of a new style of warfare to try to protect yourself and your troops from such new technologies. This was known as trench warfare. And trench warfare ultimately is it's really the most bitter kind of warfare because it leads to stalemate. Stalemate does not necessarily mean not a lot going on. The stalemate of trench warfare ultimately means there was lots of fighting, lots of death, but very little gain on either side. So trench warfare and the stalemate that it promotes ultimately contributes to how deadly this war will be. Some of the new weapons that were developed, I mentioned some of them in the earlier lecture, barbed wire, machine guns, poisonous gas, tanks, airplanes used for dropping bombs on the opposing trenches, dirigibles or zeppelins also being used, and of course on the sea, submarines. These new weapons ultimately bring the industrial world into military technology, and it will change warfare forever. In order to protect yourself against these kinds of weapons, you have to dig yourself into the ground. That's why trench warfare developed. Literally digging trenches to protect yourself from the enemy fire. But some of these weapons will also be developed to fight this kind of warfare. Poisonous gas could be sent over and it could settle in the trenches, the enemy trenches, and cause them to asphyxiate or force them out of the trenches. In which case, when you come out of the trench and occupy the land between the trenches, between the different enemy trenches, no man's land, you could be picked off one by one with rifle fire. So ultimately, the new arms, the new weapons will contribute to the lethality. Even on the seas, prior to World War I, naval battles were fought on the water. But with the invention of new weapons like the submarine, under the water also became a battleground that needed to be considered. The air also had to be considered as a battleground. Sending planes and dirigibles over enemy trenches and enemy cities to bomb them was also something that needed to be considered in this new industrial age of warfare. The result of the Great War being the first industrial war is that this becomes a war of attrition. Whichever side can hold on the longest will win. But it also leads to a great number of deaths. Now, the stalemate that I referred to before was something that needed to be considered in this. Millions of lives would be lost, especially on the Western Front of World War I, between Germany and France, and of course France being supported by Great Britain as well. That Western Front, millions would die in exchange for maybe a few yards of territory that would be lost in the next battle, with no real movement happening at all for almost 2.5 years. The Western Front was drawn along the Marne River, with no real advancement made on either side. But still, millions died in the process of that stalemate, 2.5 years. Trenches were dug all the way from the English Channel to Switzerland along that front. and it led to unprecedented casualties. There were a couple of battles that were fought in 1916 that were designed to try to end the stalemate, but alas, they would prove not to be able to do so. One of them was the Battle of Verdun in 1916. This was a battle that the Germans launched against the French forces that occupied the trenches around the city of Verdun. They pummeled the enemy trenches for days with air fire before they went over the top into no man's land to advance on the enemy trench. The idea being kill as many in the enemy trenches, before coming up over the top, so you are not more of a target while in no man's land, and then take the enemy trenches and move forward, gaining territory. Unfortunately, what ends up happening in this kind of warfare, usually, is that, yes, millions will die in the trenches with the air fire, the air bombardment, before the one side goes over the top. But once the Germans came over the top and tried to advance on Verdun, there were still enough French left in the trenches that they were able to pick them off one by one in no man's land. The result of the Battle of Verdun: 315,000 French were killed, 280,000 German casualties. Less than 160,000 bodies were recovered, even with this many killed. That means that so many were pummeled and blown to smithereens and never to be seen again. It shows you the wastefulness of this kind of warfare. So many lives were lost, yet so little was gained. Really, nothing was gained on either side. Another example is the Battle of the Somme River in 1916. Now, this was an area further north on the Western front lines that was being held by the British against the Germans. The British were trying to gain an advance over the Germans and take the enemy trench at the Battle of the Somme River. And again, they will bombard the enemy trenches for days before going over the top to try to advance. Once again, the British were only able to gain a few thousand yards, but at a very high cost. Together, between the British and the Germans, there were about 420,000 casualties just from this one battle, with no significant strategic advantage made on either side. These two battles alone show you a casualty rate of over 1 million people. Just two battles. Many more battles were fought as well. It goes to show you how wasteful this kind of warfare with stalemate can be. The Eastern Front, there was a little bit more movement in some areas on the Eastern Front after Russia was able to mobilize and start fighting. But Russia was virtually alone in the fight on the Eastern Front. They were isolated from their allies of Britain and France, and they had not modernized, as we mentioned before. They had just begun the industrialization process when Tsar Alexander II was Tsar, but that came to a screeching halt with his assassination in 1881. So they were floundering on the battlefield against the more industrialized German and Austrian fighters. Even the Ottoman Empire had industrialized more than Russia had, and so they were not doing very well. The loss of men and territory was great on the Eastern Front on the side of the Allied powers. The British would send colonial troops that they got from their colonial territories like Australia and New Zealand to help prop up the Eastern Front to bring aid to the Russians fighting in that area. The British were in charge of fighting the Ottoman Empire, and they targeted the Middle East to try to gain a foothold in that region and ultimately force the Ottoman Empire to crumble. What they ultimately did was they drew troops from Australia, New Zealand, and even Canada to try to destabilize the Middle East so the Ottoman Empire would unravel. One of the key battles was the Battle of Gallipoli in 1915. The British, feeling confident that their firepower could far outweigh any Ottoman firepower, move into the region of Gallipoli, scale a large cliff, and eventually start to fight against the Ottoman troops. The Ottoman troops saw them coming and were able to dig trenches at the top of that cliff. So when the British forces, the colonial forces, come over the top, ultimately they're mowed down by the Ottomans. And it ended up being a great failure for the British. This led to more trouble in the Ottoman region. So the British decided that they would try to destabilize places in the Arab lands of the Mideast in the Ottoman Empire. They fomented rebellion among the Arab nationals in that region, promising them that if they fought against the Ottoman Empire, when the war was over, they would be given their independence and be able to create their own nation states. And it is through fomenting Arab revolts against the Ottoman Empire that the British were finally able to destabilize the Ottoman Empire. The promises of independence, however, were never kept by the British, and ultimately the Middle East will be reoccupied, this time by Western nations, Great Britain and France, after the war's end. This goes a long way to explain the mistrust of the West that still permeates the region of the Middle East to this very day. World War I is the first truly global war with global involvement, and that needs to be looked at as well. As I mentioned in the previous slide, there was the use of troops from all over the colonial territories of the Western nations. The British will use troops from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, even from India to aid them in their fight against the Central Powers. I mentioned also that Japan would come into this process, not actually as an ally to anybody in particular. They were on the periphery. They kind of supported the cause of the Allied powers, but they did so only with lip service, and they did so they could gain access to more territories in China, with the rest of the Western powers distracted by the war. Between 1915 and 1916, Japan was able to easily move into parts of China and occupy them. Total war, the home front and propaganda. Oftentimes historians refer to World War I as a total war, meaning that it's not just the combatants who are involved in the war process, but also those on the home front. The implications of the modern industrial warfare and the concept of a home front were something that were developed because of the Great War. Governments take command of the economies in such wars. Complete command, even in areas that had become constitutional governments. We see laissez-faire go by the wayside, and the governments take command of the economies in a mercantilistic way in order to provide for the troops, in order to make sure that every economic activity in the country will be to the benefit of those fighting in the war. This will also include women in the workforce, as men are sent to battle, and increasingly the draft would increase in numbers as the war went on. So much so that men from the age of 16 to 60 in some cases would be fighting on the front lines. This led to a lack of a male workforce at home, so women would fill the void there. This will ultimately lead to many of those women pushing for civil rights after World War I is over. Since they've been keeping things going at home to support the war effort, they felt that they were in a position of bargaining for their rights after the war was over. And, just so you know, it is after World War I that women in both the United States and Great Britain do gain the right to vote. Civilian areas were also subject to bombings during a total war like World War I. They would oftentimes be bombed by air fighting, Zeppelins as well as airplanes bombing civilian centers, trying to force the government to back down. But ultimately, it will contribute to this total war idea of all segments of society being involved. And it does not really have an effect on causing a country to pull out of the war. Instead, it even further entrenches them to stay in the war at the cost of millions of lives. War propaganda also is part of this total war concept. The maintenance of public support for the war is key. Otherwise, they will falter. They will not be able to sustain themselves in this kind of war. And so oftentimes the government would utilize untruths told to bolster the agenda of that nation in order to get the support of the regular population. They sometimes would exaggerate the numbers. They would oftentimes exaggerate the goals of the enemy forces. Speaking of the enemy troops as monsters who would come and do terrible things to your family if you didn't support the war effort. The irony is the disbelief of the World War I propaganda that comes about by the end of the war makes the belief in the World War II atrocities even more difficult. Ultimately, we will talk more about this as we move into World War II, but this contributes to that idea that Hitler referred to as the big lie. The bigger the lie, the more people are willing to accept it as truth. Ultimately, what we see with a total war is a notion of many people becoming dehumanized and disenchanted with the war effort as well as with their own governments. As the stalemate continued and as millions of men lost their lives for really no gain at all, we see the loss of an entire generation of men in the Western world. This lost generation meant two things. One, so many of them from that generation never returned home because so many were lost in this stalemate of a war. But second of all, lost because those who were able to return home would never be the same again. This led to feelings of dehumanization due to the atrocities of war that they suffered through. It will lead to things like mental deterioration, shell shock, which is now known as PTSD, and feelings that the government who is organizing the war effort really does not understand what it really is like out there on the battlefield. Instead, the government continues to send in men like lambs to the slaughter. And for what purpose? For the gain of a couple of yards here and there, or for no gain at all? This led to a lot of disenchantment between those who fought the war and those who ran the war as we come to the end of that war. This will have great implications during the 1920s and 30s. the tide turns. Power shifts and new players change the direction of the war. I mentioned in an earlier lecture the fact that it will be during World War I that we see the collapse of the Russian Empire and the beginning of what is known as the Russian Revolution. This happens in 1917. As we know, Russia was a backward nation, if you will. It was farther behind than their allies when it came to industrial output, and they were having difficulty in fighting on the Eastern Front, so isolated from their allies. And ultimately, this led to great losses of territory between 1914 and 1917. The Russian people, by the time we get to early 1917, had started to become disenchanted with the war effort in Russia. As a matter of fact, the majority of the population in Russia no longer wanted to be a participant in this war, and they urged the Tsar to withdraw from the war. Nicholas II was the Tsar at the time, and he felt that his hands were tied. He could not pull out of the war because that would risk the relationship with the other Allied powers and could lead to a loss of territory for Russia. So he was kind of between a rock and a hard place. The people at home don't support the war effort. He feels like he can't pull out because of the Allies and the implication of loss of territory. And ultimately, this culminates in him withdrawing from his throne. He abdicates his throne in March of 1917. The tide had turned against the Tsar. He had domestic problems at home with peasant rebellions and starvation. He had problems with maintaining the front lines in the war effort. And so ultimately, ending a 300-year reign of the Romanov dynasty in Russia, Nicholas II abdicates his throne in March of 1917. And very quickly, a number of classically liberal-minded individuals, nobles and upper middle-class men, began to form a provisional government that would be put in place until they could have elections after dealing with the war. The provisional government saw themselves in a very similar predicament to the Tsar, feeling as if they couldn't really pull out of the war, but they didn't have the support of the war behind them with the Russian people either. And this will lead to another thing happening that will work against Russia staying in the war. Lenin, who had been abroad for quite some time, he was a Russian national, a socialist himself, very much a believer in Marx principles, but saw himself as more of a Marxist than Marx. We'll talk more about his ideas later. But he was exiled from Russia earlier on, prior to the war's beginning. Lenin was smuggled back into Russia by the Germans because Lenin, being an internationally known socialist, living in exile, had basically preached against Russia being in this war. And he ultimately gained a lot of followers through his writings. Germany felt if they made sure Lenin came back into Russia, that he would have enough support from the Russian people to pull all of Russia out of the war, and then Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire would no longer have to worry about a two-front war. And they would gain territory because they would force the Russians to sign a treaty that ceded over a great number of territories to them. Lenin comes into Russia. He challenged the provisional government. He gained the support of a number of people in Russia that also supported his socialist ideas. They became known as the Bolsheviks. and Lenin saw them as his professional Marxist revolutionaries. Now you're reading Lenin's What Is to Be Done, and this is where Lenin puts his own spin on Marxism. He argued that the proletariat revolution had not happened inevitably as Marx had predicted. And this was largely because capitalism had lasted longer than it should have because of imperialism. He argued that imperialism ultimately would lead to warfare between the nations. And when that happened, World War I, that would be the opportunity for the proletariat to rise up and oppose the bourgeoisie and bring about the end of capitalism. However, Lenin did not believe, like Marx did, that it was just going to happen from the proletariats themselves. He believed that there needed to be a professional group of revolutionaries, professional Marxist revolutionaries, that would deliver the revolution to the proletariat. And ultimately, those became known as the Bolsheviks. In November of 1917, the Bolsheviks were able to depose the provisional government that had been established after the abdication of the Tsar, and they were able to take over the government in Russia. The November Revolution of 1917 is also known as the Bolshevik Revolution. And after the Bolshevik Revolution, instead of the state disappearing with the destruction of classes, like Marx had anticipated, we had the creation of the USSR under a left-wing totalitarian government. Soviet communism was born. A different idea about communism than Marx had originally said, because ultimately it amalgamated all classes in Russia except for the professional Marxist revolutionaries. Those Bolsheviks ultimately become the backbone of what is known as the Communist Party. And instead of the classes disappearing, that class remains in place and they take control of the government itself. And that party is controlled by one man. So that's why it becomes a totalitarian dictatorship. One party rule, but that one party is controlled by one man, and that is Lenin. Ultimately, after taking control over Russia, Lenin pulls Russia out of the war, which is exactly what Germany had hoped would happen, that he would destabilize Russia enough that they would have to pull out of the war. And Lenin and his Bolsheviks sign a very costly treaty with Germany in order to pull out of the war. It's the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it's signed in 1918, which ceded 1/4 of Russia's territory to Germany and Austria, Germany in particular. The territories of Austria, a number of Baltic countries, and the Ukraine will all be ceded over to Germany and Austria as a result of this treaty. Russia would be allowed to pull out of the war, but it would be very costly for them to do so. Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire no longer had to worry about a two-front war. Splitting their forces between two fronts had become so costly, it caused stalemate on both fronts. They were spread too thin. This is exactly what Germany had hoped, so they could now concentrate just on the Western Front and finish those Western allies off. The hopes of Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire, however, to be able to turn the tide in the war in their favor by reducing the Eastern Front of the war, ultimately prove faulty. Because the same year as Russia becomes destabilized and ends up pulling out of the war, 1917, that's the same year that the United States finally enters the war on the side of the Allies. The U.S. had declared themselves neutral prior to the war beginning. We went through this time where we declared ourselves splendidly isolated. What was going on in Europe was a European problem, and we did not want to get involved in a European problem. We wanted to maintain our trade relationships with European nations that we had on both sides of the war. But by the time we get into the war, the United States had been selling supplies and as well as weapons to the Allied powers primarily. And Germany recognized this and saw what the U.S. was doing as not really maintaining their neutrality, but instead favoring the Allied powers. So what ended up happening is the Germans started to use a blockade to try to keep the American supplies out of the British and French hands. They did this blockade of British overseas trade, which ultimately led to the concept of German unrestricted submarine warfare, where they started to attack trade ships coming into Great Britain and France to deliver supplies by sinking them with their torpedoes from their U-boats, the German U-boats, the submarines. One of these ships was the Lusitania that was sunk back in May of 1915. This was a ship that had a number of Americans on it. Almost 1,200 lives were lost on this ship. 128 of them were American citizens. They were non-combatants, obviously, but they were casualties of this. The United States had also put munitions on this ship to sell to the British and the French. So after the loss of U.S. lives, they saw this as an excuse to effectively join the war effort. It will not happen for another 2 years, but that was the beginning of the decision-making that would go into the minds of the United States people into supporting the Allied efforts. By April of 1917, after more ships were torpedoed by German U-boats, the United States declares war on Germany and the Central Powers, April of 1917. This will turn the tide against the Central Powers. Simultaneously with Russia pulling out of the war, the United States is entering the war. So even though the two-front war ends for the Central Powers, they are so beleaguered and worn out by this time for 3.5 years of fighting that they are not able to effectively thwart the U.S. troops that are coming in to resuscitate the Allied cause. After the United States enters the war, within a 1.5 years, the war will come to an end, and the Central Powers will be defeated. The United States troops are fresh. They are able to, as I said before, resuscitate the Allied cause on the Western Front. The Germans and the Austrians who remain fighting, the Ottoman Empire had pretty much been neutralized by the British colonial troops at this point. The German and Austrian troops are so worn out that by the fall of 1918, they were exhausted, and ultimately they were forced to sue for peace. Bulgaria, the remains of the Ottoman Empire, the Austrians, and the Germans surrender in November of 1918. November 11th, 1918 was Armistice Day. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice was signed. A ceasefire was called. November 11th is still remembered and recognized as Armistice Day all around the world. Here in the United States, we call it Veterans Day. An armistice was called on November 11th of 1918, but an armistice is not a peace. A peace is something that needs to be diligently hammered out. And the peace of World War I was almost as hard to fight for as the war itself. It begins with the Paris Peace Conference that is called in 1918 and continues through 1919. The Paris Peace Conference was dominated by the Allied powers because they were the victors. By this point, it is France, Great Britain, and the United States. Russia was not involved because they had pulled out of the war and signed their own treaty with Germany and Austria earlier on. So, they were not invited to the negotiations. What's interesting is that normally with a peace conference, both sides of the war that has just come to an end are invited and they hammer out the details of the peace. They negotiate. That's the way things had always been done. But with the Paris Peace Conference that ends World War I, that will not happen. No Central Powers were invited to participate in the writing of the peace agreements. Instead, the peace treaties that come out of the Paris Peace Conference are dictated by the victors, the Allied forces, to the vanquished, the Central Powers. These dictated peace agreements will create a great deal of animosity in the minds of not just the governments of those vanquished countries, but also in the population. Especially those soldiers who return home having been through hell on the battlefield. And for what? For nothing. And their countries are vanquished and have a dictated peace that they have to adhere to. The peace treaties that come out of the Paris Peace Conference are harsh on the Central Powers, since the Central Powers were not invited to negotiate the peace terms. They are very harsh. They are dictated by the Allied powers. And of course, since the conference takes place in France, the Paris Peace Conference, France has a lot of pull at this conference. And they are out for revenge. You see, the majority of the Western Front of the war was fought on French soil. And not only were a great deal of Frenchmen killed in this war, but a lot of the territory in France would never be the same, would be completely ruined. Nothing would grow ever again. So they wanted extremely punitive terms towards Germany in particular, whom they saw as the real instigators of the war. Now, folks, we've discussed the causes and the factors leading up to World War I. And we know that Germany was not solely responsible for this war. But France saw it that way, and they were out to prove a point at these treaty negotiations. The peace treaty specifically that dealt with Germany is known as the Versailles Treaty, and it was released in 1919. Not only was Germany forced to disarm, they were not allowed to have a large standing army or navy. They also lost a great deal of territory, including all of those territories that they had just received from Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They were never able to capitalize on those. Germany also lost most of its colonial empire territories. They were forced to pay heavy reparation payments, most of which would go directly to France. And these reparation payments, a schedule was set up for these reparations to be paid. They were so heavy that Germany would never be able to pay them back, especially because a lot of the territories that Germany lost were their lucrative territories when it came to industrial output. And so if you take away Germany's ability to make money, but then force them to pay these high reparation payments, how in the world are they supposed to do this? But even though all of those terms were so punitive towards Germany, probably the most hated of all of the terms was the War Guilt Clause, where Germany had to sign off on accepting responsibility for the war beginning. Again, Germany was not alone in the causes of this war. What had gone on involved all of the nations that participated in the forming of alliances, in the arms race, in those nationalistic rivalries. But Germany was forced to sign the War Guilt Clause to say that they were solely responsible. This War Guilt Clause will be so hated by the German people that it allows for the beginning of grumblings against these Western nations once again about this dictated peace to them. And this will be fodder for the Nazi propaganda mill, which comes about in the 20s and 30s. We'll discuss more about that specifically in a later lecture. The Austrian Empire was also completely dismantled at the Paris Peace Conference, lost most of their territory. Most of that polyglot empire will be carved up into new nation states, like Czechoslovakia and Romania and others. The Austrian Empire was left basically with Vienna and the surrounding forest land. The Ottoman Empire would also be dismantled by the Treaty of Sevres in 1920. The Republic of Turkey will be born out of that and later be recognized by the international organization known as the League of Nations. Now, this brings up the importance of the United States President Woodrow Wilson and his ideas for what should happen once the war was over. Wilson, prior to the war's ending, had come up with 14 points that he thought should be incorporated into any peace negotiations that would happen once the war was over. He was a bit of an idealist, and he thought that after the war was over, that perhaps the United States could help to usher in democratic reforms all over the world. That in spite of the destruction of the war, that maybe the fruit that could be produced out of the ashes would be democracy. And he outlined 14 points that he thought all parties should accept once the war was over, including sharing culpability for the war, not allowing these alliances which pit so many nations against one another, everybody disarming to amp down the arms race. These were just a number of the points that he had. But he also believed that there should be an international organization created that would maintain the balance of power, much like the old Concert of Europe had done, but they would also help to maintain peace and try to help the blossoming of that democracy that he hoped would be the fruit of the war. Ultimately, Wilson, who was one of the people who was invited to the peace treaty negotiations, most of his 14 points would be negotiated away by the French and the British. And instead, the majority of his points would go by the wayside. But he made sure that his most important point, that international organization, did come to fruition. And that was the League of Nations. Ultimately, it would result in the creation of an international organization with 42 original member states 26 of which were non-European. And this would allow for self-determination and democracy to blossom throughout the world while maintaining the balance of power and preventing warfare. The idea behind the League of Nations was that nations could come together and discuss their problems through open diplomacy rather than coming to blows. Unfortunately, the League of Nations was really nothing but a polite fiction from its very creation. Interestingly enough, the United States Congress, that has to sign off on any treaty that the United States enters into, neglected to ratify the Versailles Treaty with Germany because the Congress saw it as too punitive towards Germany. They recognized that it would be virtually impossible for Germany to ever pay these reparations, that it was ultimately going to cause more problems in the long run if it was not altered. And so the Versailles Treaty was never ratified by the U.S. Congress. And since the League of Nations was part of that treaty negotiation, that meant that the United States could not join the League of Nations. Without ratifying the treaty, they could not join the League of Nations, which was part of that treaty. So the irony is that the League of Nations, which was the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson, the United States President, ultimately does not include the United States as a member. And because of that, the United States, which could have been the cornerstone in the League of Nations, leaves the League of Nations as a powerless organization with no real teeth to get anything done or to promote peace at all. The League of Nations had no teeth, and it was shot in the foot from the get-go. We'll discuss more of the implications of the weak League of Nations and the impact that will have on the post-war world in our next lecture. Thank you.